Hi, this is Gene Bohensky from Reel to Reel Warehouse. This is going to be quite of an extensive video. This is a video that I made based upon your request, which was to talk a little bit about the pre-recorded tapes that have been made over the years. We really don't get involved with that too much. I mean, I'm not a big collector of pre-recorded tapes, but because I come across so many lots, I end up getting a huge amount of tapes. And I currently have about 400 individual titles for sale on eBay, if you want to check out our eBay store. But a lot of you want to know, how are they made? What are the different types of tapes? Should I buy them? Are they useful? Do they sound good? I'm going to try to answer all these kind of questions in this video. First, a little bit of history. Really, the major market for consumer reel-to-reel tape recorders really started in the United States, post-war. Really in the 50s it got going. It got going later in the 60s in Germany, but they weren't much for pre-recorded tapes. And then even later on in Japan, that really started in the late 60s and 70s. But the real beginning of pre-recorded tapes you can trace back to 1957, when the major record companies brought out their line of 2-track inline heads. Some of them have stacked head tapes. This is before the later 4-track stereo movement. And they brought out an amazing array of tapes that were really recorded on a 1-to-1 basis, on the same speed as the master, on all tube equipment, and the sound is incredible today. And there's a reason why those tapes are sought after. Some of those tapes, I'll just show some of them that I have. I don't have a lot, but I'll show some of them. Some of them are Concertapes. This was a brand from 1957. They came in these plastic boxes with these ubiquitous 6-window reels. They used Audiotape as a stock. So standard Audiotape, acetate tape was used for those. Another company that brought out tapes early on, a whole line of them, was Capitol in their ZD series. These were also inline head tapes. This is one of my favorite titles. This is from my personal collection. This is Jackie Gleason's Velvet Brass, 2 tracks, 7.5 inches per second. Inside, they even came with the Scotch reel at the time, with the list of songs right on it. This is a fantastic title, and the sound is fantastic. From 1957, it's amazing how these things sound. What I did on this, I affixed a leader tape, which is something that I recommend on any of these old tapes, that you affix a good 3 foot of polyester leader tape on the end of the acetate tape base. This protects your acetate tape from drying out and kind of crumbling at the end. And also when you're winding it, at this age, you're talking a tape that's almost 70 years old. At this age, this tape is brittle. And if it's not stored properly, it can crack or rip during usage. There are also some interesting type of titles available that you wouldn't see in today's market. We have something like Stereo Master Tape of Railroad Sounds. Somebody actually spent $15 on this in the late 50s. Railroad sounds, sounds of steam and diesel. Really crazy kind of titles. Another company from New Jersey. New Jersey was a big area for a lot of recording. A lot of the famous jazz artists recorded in New Jersey in the late 50s and 60s. And there are a lot of record companies that started. One of them was Livingston Master Tape Treasury. This is also from 1957. And they came with this type of tape. I'm not really sure what the brand is. It looks like it could be an audio tape that was used for Livingston. Anyway, those tapes at the time, it's important to know, those tapes are kind of all have the same performance. And really at the time, there weren't any tape tests, for the first 15 years of production, up until the early 60s. Most of the tape was all the same. All the brands kind of had the same performance. There wasn't a big difference between them. The big difference was really not in the tape. It was in the machine's ability to get the performance out of the tape. And so that's why the tape was not as important as later on. But that's another story. Here's another interesting one. Sound effects, audio fidelity sound effects, doctored for Super Stereo series. audio fidelity, you know, really, I'm not sure anyone would really want to buy something like this today. There were some interesting record labels that came out early on. We had Encore, which was one. They had a lot of tapes, kind of a popular brand. This is another one. Bel Canto had a line of tapes. This is a Lewis and Keeley, never heard it. Can't really comment on it, but these were some of the original pre-recorded tapes made. And they were expensive. I mean, they were $8 to $15 for a reel in 1957. Here's a hi-fi tape of George Wright Showtime Wurlitzer, if you really like organ music. I don't. Here's another interesting company, Sonotape. They also did 2-track tapes, also with very good sound. Hard to find. They're rare. I mean, they're getting on 70 years old. So they're kind of interesting. You know, again, they're all made with tube equipment. And when you put them on, if you have a 2-track machine, when you put those on that machine, you're really going to hear that glowing, warm tube sound and that recording sound. It's kind of unique. You know, you can really tell the difference in those recordings. And that's why they're so sought after, because you can hear how great they sound. One company I want to talk about that existed for a very short time was Everest Records. They used Scotch 190, a long play tape, acetate tapes. Everest was an interesting company. You could look at them online. They actually were the first to record a series of classical performances with 35 millimeter magnetic recording. It had a 3-track, large track recording format, and they had great sound. And these Everests are from my personal collection. They have a fantastic sound to them, and if you find them, they're not easy to find because I don't think they made any money. They went out of business after a year. But there's a bunch of these, Billy the Kid. There's a bunch of them that have a really good sound. If you find them, you know, keep them. They're kind of very interesting. So after the Everest, let's go to kind of the commercial tapes that were made through the 1960s. You know, as the 1960s progressed, the companies bringing out the tapes went from really nice, high quality mastering and recording to higher speed duplicators where they would duplicate in 4:1, 8:1. And the quality kind of suffered a little bit. Also, to reduce cost, a lot of titles came out in 3 3/4 speed instead of a 7.5 speed, which was common at the time. You know, that most of the companies used the standard audio tape, standard acetate audio tape in long play or standard play. They used the Scotch 111. They used the Scotch 190. 190 is the long play. That's the red oxide, which you can see in a lot of the pre-recorded tapes. A lot of the Ampex tapes were also used. They used, you know, their 311 or 611 or 321 or 621. Those are acetate tapes, either standard play or long play. Those were kind of the mainstay tapes. And those tapes, you know, they all have a great sound when they're recorded with the tube equipment and when they were biased properly. They have a full range sound, but people don't realize, you know, if you take one of those newer machines, like if you have a newer machine from the 70s, and you try to record on those older tapes, they're going to sound dull. But back then, bias was adjusted specifically for those old tapes, and they sounded great. So a lot of those old tapes sound great. So let's look at some of them through the 60s. You know, some of the titles that I like. This is Golden Age of Dance Bands from the early 60s. This was a very high quality recording of the original Glenn Miller arrangements. I like that one. Pretty good are these old Jackie Gleason tapes. You know, I like the Velvet Brass. This one is kind of from the later in the 60s, Music for Lovers Only. This wasn't a 2-track release. This was a 4-track release. But the 7.5 inch per second version has a great glowing, warm sound. He was very interesting because when he did his recordings, whenever he used drums, he didn't use any cymbals. So it was a very warm, mellow sound. Very interesting arrangements. let's look at some of the other things through the 60s. This was a classic. One of my favorites is Time Out, Dave Brubeck. This is from Columbia, another great sound. This is one of the original releases from the early 60s, and you can tell because it has a catalog on the back page and a catalog inside. In general, the early releases sound better than the newer ones, and that's because of the way they were duplicated. They weren't duplicated with high speed and mass production in mind when they first came out. Later through the 70s, there were some other interesting things that happened. There was more into mass production, but then you also had kind of like a change because actually music consumption changed. As everyone knows, you had the beginning of jazz and then rock and roll. People liked rock, when they had the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or those type of titles. Very few of those titles made it onto reel-to-reel, and that's because the people who bought those albums would buy records. They wouldn't really buy the reel-to-reels because the reel-to-reels were really for, the more upper class and people that had a lot of money. Like your parents would have at the time. They wouldn't buy it. It's like your dad at that time buying, Led Zeppelin. That wouldn't really happen, right? The parents were horrified of that kind of music. But today, obviously that's what people want because that's what people like. And those titles are rare on the ground, right? I mean, like, for example, the Johnny Cash Greatest Hits, that's hard to find. Here's another one, Eric Clapton at his best. This was a stereo tape from the 70s, also hard to find. There's a lot of those type of titles. I don't have them because I'm not a collector of those, but a lot of people are. And then later on, you had, through the 70s, the tape stock kind of changed. On the Ampex side, Ampex took over a lot of that high-speed duplicating, and they ran a duplicating center in Illinois. And they really used their standard 641, was their mainstay. So a lot of the tapes that we have here from that time period, let's look at even these from Deutsche Grammophon. These big tapes, these were all Ampex 641, and that continued, I think, through a lot of the 70s. Was a major tape. The other companies started bringing out other tapes as they catered more to the hi-fi class, and those hi-fi class people were primarily buying classical music, right? That was the primary demographic. So a lot of the tapes that you find online are classical music tapes. They bought them in Japan and they bought them in the US. And there was a lot of really good, interesting things from that. A lot of the early stuff was on that. RCA was a big label for that. And you had, let's say, this Madame Butterfly. This is from 1963. It's a double tape, and you had double reels inside the box of a full opera. There was a lot of those who were sold. People don't really care about that stuff now, but back then people spent money on that. And the sound was fantastic. So they used those tapes for that. Really, when you look at the kind of tapes that people were listening to, later on you had the record clubs, and people started using the record clubs to buy things that were cheap. And here's a Columbia record club, Mormon Tabernacle Choir album. This is all like, these all have small tape in it. This Columbia, they bought at the time Reeves-Soundcraft. So a lot of those Columbia tapes were using that tape stock. RCA bought Sarki's Tarzan. On the RCA side, they used that tape stock. So a lot of the times, the record companies started aligning themselves with tape manufacturers. So here's another one. These were also record club. This is Neil Diamond Gold. This is a 3 3/4 tape, and you can see there's barely any tape on it. It's really old style tape. It's not shiny. So this was kind of like standard tape, type 1 tape recorded at 3 3/4. I don't know why people want these. They don't really sound that great, and they were duplicated at high speed, this record club stuff, but people spend a lot of money on it. But it's not really for me. Let's talk about some of the rare stuff from Japan. Japan was an interesting country because they had a very big middle class. There were, I think at the time in the late 60s and 70s, they had probably the second largest middle class, even larger than in Germany. And they spent a lot of money on their stuff. And for a short time, they spent a lot of money on pre-recorded tapes. And I want to show you some of them. They were very interesting. This is a whole line of tapes from TIAC. They have a whole line of tapes that they brought out. And on the reel, you have the classic TIAC reel. And they were really into this. This is the local jazz stuff. It actually tells you what tape they use, what tape stock. So here they used BASF PES 35LH. They were using a high-end BASF tape in '69. Now the reason why that is if you, and I haven't finished the timeline yet, is that at the time, the Japanese didn't really have their tape production made where they were making great tapes. The best tapes were still coming from the U.S. and particularly Germany. Those BASF tapes were at that time the best, and TIAC used those tapes for their own reproduction. Here's the TIAC Tape Club, 1972, with a whole bunch of special recordings that they made. You also had, here's some classics. London had a whole line of tapes from Japan. These all used, really, if you take a look at it, they all used Sony tape. This, at the time, this tape was a Sony ES tape, which predates the SLH, their high-end tape. Very interesting, great sound, I would say. Other classic tapes from Japan that are in my collection are this CBS tape of Miles Davis in Japan. This was only released in Japan on reel. This is, I think, worth a lot of money. It's not even in anything. And they use Sony SLH tape, and they duplicate it in a slow duplication speed. These tapes sound fantastic. I also want to point out on the back is the price, 2,800 yen. You know, at the time, that was equivalent to like $25 for these things. These were expensive, but people paid for them. One of my favorite titles is this Liberty Blue Note Jazz, and this is basically like copies of the master tape, you know. And this is one of my favorite tapes. It's on a Toshiba reel. You know, you have Horace Silver, Herbie Hancock. You have just fantastic selection from the Blue Note catalog. These are very hard to find, very rare on the ground, but if you get them, the sound is just incredible. I mean, I really have to say. Here's another interesting one, Mantovani Magic. People would think this is kind of like one of the lousy titles, but this sound of this tape, recorded in Japan, is pretty phenomenal. So, I mean, I recommend, you know, they're hard to find. I sell some of them, but not all of them. They're rarely on eBay because there just weren't many of them made. And they kind of stopped production in the early 70s. But they had the Beatles on those releases, and those are hard to find because they're made on a different stock, recorded differently, the sound is better. Let's talk about some of the other interesting things that happened through the 70s. There was a line of tapes made for quadraphonic recordings. I only have this one here. This is this kind of weird highway one from the Mystic Moods Orchestra. But there were a bunch of quadraphonic tapes that came out. They're also hard to find. That's where you have 4 channels in one direction. They exist. There's some that was in the mid-70s. But they also had a very good sound. And that's kind of where the market bifurcated, where there was the type of titles for the everyday consumer and then for the audiophile. Some of the other things that were very interesting for audiophiles is that a lot of tapes, particularly tapes for classical, in the 70s started to be made with Dolby. And there were some Dolby system tapes recorded. This is a company called Archive. I think a company called Stereotape made these tapes, and they used the Scotch Dynarange 177 or 212 series as their stock. That's another ubiquitous formula that was used in broadcast. It's one of the that's one of the forgotten good formulas. There's a ton of that tape around. It doesn't go sticky. It has a very good quality. There's only some small batches that shed or that where you have binder failure, but they used it a lot on these Dolby tapes. So this is a nice one, Claudio Monteverdi on the Vespers. This is another one, music of the Gothic era, another double reel tape, also in Dolby. Later on, you had some classics from a company called Barclay-Crocker, which people might remember. This was kind of like a late upstart, 78, 79, 80 time frame, where they produced these tapes with the Dolby system on their own equipment. Very high quality sound. For the most part, they used Scotch Dynarange, the 212 or 177. And they also use some Audiotape Q15 that squeals. I have some of that, both of those. But there's a whole bunch of these out there. They're kind of going between $20 and $50 a title. They last a long time. They sound great. But you got to like classical music because that's what the market was. The people with money, that's what they spend money on. There was also some other companies. This is one that kind of a private company from Titanic Records, real-time duplicated on direct-to-tape recordings. I have a bunch of these. And they used, at the time, Agfa 468. I have a couple of other titles on Sony Ferrochrome. There were some people in the early 80s that were experimenting with some low-volume, high-quality duplication for some of the old reel-to-reel holdouts that were still into collecting and were still believing in the sound quality. Now, I just want to make another comment when I finish this tape out and this segment out is one of the things I like is Christmas music on reel-to-reel, because some of that Christmas music is timeless, and even though you wouldn't listen to those things, to the other things those artists had, sometimes the Christmas music is a little cute. One of the ones I like is this Festival of Lessons and Carols from the King's College Choir. This was recorded in 1958 and was released in 1960. This has a fantastic sound and one of the early tapes, great sound for the holidays. There's an old Concertapes Sound of Christmas. This is kind of like a program they created for it in 1957. It's really old. It's aged, obviously. Here's another similar one. That's only 15 minutes. Here's another Christmas Eve in the Cathedral. This is kind of this unique program that Sonotape put out. It's about 15 minutes. Here's a couple other ones. Christmas Hymns by George Beverly Shee. Merry Christmas Carols. This is from the pipe organ and dual chimes. This is Bel Canto, also from 1958, 2-track. It's just a pipe organ. So that's all you get is Christmas carols played on pipe organ. Of course, one of my favorites that's become more popular today is Ray Conniff. We Wish You a Merry Christmas. This came out, I think, in 63 or 64. Great sound on reel. Now you hear it everywhere, but for a long time it wasn't played. Great sound when you hear the duplication. Of course, this classic, Sing Along with Mitch. This is something that my parents couldn't stand, but I think it's kind of funny. But, it's, again, some of the interesting things you found in reel-to-reel. There's lots of old Christmas albums on reel-to-reel that kind of have that unique sound. Anyway, I hope this was helpful to kind of give you a survey of pre-recorded tapes. I showed you a lot of things. I wouldn't be afraid of them. Just to keep in mind, you want to protect your acetate tapes by putting leaders on them. You want to keep them in a cool and dry place so they don't get ruined. These things are definitely period pieces. They're not going to be made again. So it's definitely a preservation of recordings that really come from that time. I always like to think about the fact that those people that made those recordings, they're not around today. Their personalities of people are different today. The sensibility is gone, and what you hear on the recording is a real piece of history. So with that in mind, enjoy the tapes, and I hope this has been helpful. Gene Bohensky from Reel to Reel Warehouse.